all the journalists that have tuned in for this very important conference. I'm really very pleased to be joined on this occasion by the Honorable Mitoha and Dr. Hatchett in London to discuss how we can ensure African will have access to COVID-19 vaccine once they become available. In the past, we Africans have all too often ended up at the back of the queue for vaccine, as we have to make sure that this doesn't happen again. The COVAX initiative that we are going to discuss today is a global initiative that, by the way, needs to mitigate this. Once there is a vaccine that is licensed and approved, COVAX will work to secure at least 220 million doses of vaccine for the continent. This will not necessarily cover all the needs of the continent, but at least will cover 20% of the African population, initially prioritizing those who are at the front line, the healthcare workers, then expanding to cover vulnerable groups such as the elderly or those with a pre-existing condition. So this groundbreaking initiative that we are going to discuss today is led by the CEPI, and we are very much pleased to have Dr. Hatchett with us today, who's the CEPI CEO, but also by the Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and WHO. Together, we are working with government, but also different vaccine manufacturers to procure the necessary vaccine doses. This, all 54 countries on the continent have expressed to some extent the interest for this very important initiative. Higher and middle income countries have agreed to self-finance their doses through the COVAX facility. And the remaining countries in Africa will be eligible to receive some financial support through the COVAX Advanced Market Commitment that is managed by Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. Donation from donor countries, the private sector, philanthropists will help fund vaccine procurement for these lower and income country. The global initiative delivers Africa what we can say a buying power as countries work together to pool all their resources and together secure the best the world will have to offer in terms of COVID-19 vaccines. The vaccines will be distributed equally to all participating countries, proportional to each country's population. We have often talked about equity, and I think this will be at the center of this initiative to make sure that no one is left behind. So this is really a very significant step, but there is a lot to do to make it quite a successful initiative. So to roll out a vaccine effectively across Africa, communities must be engaged and understand the need for vaccination. We have to start working with communities now to prepare the way for one of the largest vaccination campaigns that Africa has ever experienced. Countries, member states have got the experience, and I'm glad just 2 weeks ago, Africa were celebrating the interruption of wild poliovirus on the African continent. So we have the experience, we have the means to roll out this vaccine, and we hope to build on this achievement to move forward. So countries in Africa are signing up to the COVAX initiative as the continent is starting to see a glimmer of hope. As of yesterday, more than 1 million people have recovered from COVID-19 on the continent. This is really something we need absolutely to stress. However, there is a general, while we are seeing a general trend, downtrend in the number of cases on the continent, with 23 countries reporting at least a 20% decrease in case compared to the previous 7 days. We need absolutely to interpret these with great caution, as other countries have, as we are currently seeing in other regions, witnessed steep declines only to experience an uptick later on. So African countries need to continue to put in place the established and well documented non-pharmaceutical measure to make sure that we are containing and ultimately suppress the circulation of this virus. So these flare-ups are likely to continue until we can find a safe and effective vaccine and ensure that everyone in need can access it. This is why COVAX is so important. This is why today we are here to discuss and to brief the media around this initiative. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahigo. As you have said, the most important thing to remember is that Africa has done this before and has done this successfully. So let's talk about a little bit more, at least, about CEPI. Dr. Hatchett, how would you say that CEPI is supporting vaccine access in Africa?
Sure, thank you, CEPI. So, and happy to speak to that point in just a moment. I do think that for many people on the call today, CEPI may not be a familiar organization, certainly not as familiar as Gavi. We are a new organization. We were established after the Ebola epidemic with a mission of developing vaccines against emerging infectious diseases and helping to prepare for potentially for new emerging infectious diseases like COVID, and to ensure access to those vaccines for the populations that need them. That is part of our mission statement. Before COVID, we were working on a number of vaccines that are relevant in the African setting. We were supporting the further development of Ebola vaccines. We had supported the development of Lassa fever vaccines and brought the first Lassa fever vaccines into clinical trials globally. We are also working on Rift Valley fever vaccine, chikungunya vaccines, and on other diseases. When COVID emerged, we immediately initiated COVID-19 vaccine development efforts. Our first partnerships with private sector companies were established by the end of January. And over the last 8 or 9 months, we have built up what we believe to be the largest and most diverse portfolio of COVID-19 vaccines globally. We have supported 9 vaccines, including a number that are among the world's leading vaccines. The AstraZeneca vaccine, originally we supported the work at Oxford, now have supported the work at AstraZeneca, the Moderna vaccine, the Novavax vaccine, and a wide slate of others that are being developed globally, some in North America, some in Europe, some in the Asia Pacific region. As we developed those vaccines, we realized that ensuring equitable access to those vaccines was potentially going to present a challenge unless we took very active steps to ensure that they were delivered globally and delivered equitably. We believe that vaccines are a critical tool to bringing the pandemic under control and ultimately to an end. We also believe that the pandemic is a global problem and that you cannot solve the pandemic in individual countries. You have to solve it globally, which means that vaccine has to be distributed globally. And we were very mindful of the experience in 2009 when during the last pandemic, the H1N1 pandemic, when a handful of rich countries basically bought up the global supply of vaccine and only very limited quantities were delivered to the rest of the world and to developing countries, as I like to say, too little and too late. That vaccine was delivered. And so we have been working since really quite early in the pandemic, really since the beginning of March, to devise systems that would allow for equitable allocation, would allow for pooled procurement among globally cooperating nations, and have been promoting an ethic of vaccine multilateralism, which we have contrasted to vaccine nationalism. In doing that, we have joined like-minded partners, particularly including WHO, obviously, as well as Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and we have established the COVAX initiative under the Access to COVID-19 Tools, or ACT, accelerator. And the COVAX initiative is built around the core portfolio of vaccines that CEPI has supported. It builds on WHO's strengths in setting normative goals and objectives for the world, for managing the regulation of products, for managing equitable allocation, and for developing allocation frameworks, and the strengths of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, in terms of procurement and delivery of vaccines. The COVAX initiative, as Richard said in his opening remarks, is really the only global initiative to ensure equitable access to vaccines. It has brought together over 170 countries have expressed interest. We recently received the expressions of interest from self-financing countries, which are one part of the COVAX initiative, as Richard mentioned. And as of this morning, we have 78 countries that have signaled their intent to join COVAX as self-financing countries. And we have 92 countries that will have expressed interest through the advanced market commitment that Gavi is establishing. The expressions of interest are still rolling in, but I think that represents a tremendous vote of confidence in vaccine multilateralism, and we are tremendously excited to be moving forward with our goal of ending the pandemic, or the acute phase of the pandemic, by the end of 2021. COVAX's overall objective is to secure in the region of 2 billion doses of vaccine by the end of 2021, and to ensure that countries can meet the needs of at least 20% of their populations. And as Richard described, that is to target the populations at greatest risk of acquiring the disease, the healthcare workers, as well as those at the greatest risk of having severe illness and to prevent death. This is a critical moment for COVAX as these expressions of interest come in, and as momentum builds to support this global, collaborative, collective effort to defeat the pandemic. And I think for this to succeed, we need to work together as a international consortium of countries. But as Richard also emphasized, I think the effort to be ready to receive vaccine after the vaccines are tested, after they are shown to be safe and effective, goes all the way down to the community level. And we need to work very diligently with the countries that will be receiving vaccine to make sure that they are prepared to receive the vaccine, and to conduct, as Richard again said, one of the largest vaccination efforts in world history. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Hatchett. And we'd now like to welcome and thank once again the Honorable Vice Minister of the Republic of Equatorial Guinea, Honorable Mitoho Ondoho Ayekeba. Thank you so much for joining us, Vice Minister, and we really appreciate your time. We'd like to hear from you, especially a very interesting concept, for me at least, Dr. Hatchett, that was talking about vaccine multilateralism, because there has been a lot of talk about how we're going to prevent some of this bulk buying of supply, as you mentioned, by the richer countries. Vice Minister, Honorable Vice Minister Mitoho, if you could perhaps just give us a sense of why Equatorial Guinea is involved in this, and what your experience has been, especially the COVAX initiative.
Hi, good morning, dear Dr. Richard Hatchett, dear Richard Mihigo, CFO Mark Wetler, dear guests. On behalf of the government of Equatorial Guinea, I would like to thank WHO, CEPI, Gavi, and other partners and organizations co-leading the COVAX project for such an excellent initiative framed with this innovative approach. I would like to also thank WHO for giving Equatorial Guinea the opportunity to share its views and at this important platform and topic. COVID-19 has devastated people's health and economics everywhere. It has changed our lifestyle and has created fear in our societies. We believe that against common enemy, the world needs to fight together, and this is why my country, being a middle-income economy, has agreed to self-finance the vaccine for our population. Equatorial Guinea believes that we need a common approach, and we have joined up the COVAX platform mainly because we think it is the most effective way to garner the right approach, because we can ensure that our people can access the COVID-19 vaccine, which are safe, scientifically tested in a timely manner, and at a lower possible cost. The COVID-19, besides being an unprecedented international health emergency, it is also a test on our human ingenuity to transcend our individualities and destroy all barriers looking to act with a common purpose. It is therefore our sincere hope that all countries that will have committed to this wonderful initiative will have equal access to safe vaccines, regardless of their economic status and power. No country should be excluded, and we believe that nobody should be left without protection against this virus. And this is mainly our perspective as our view, why we believe this platform is very important, and the fact that we as an African country, we are pulling ourselves together to take advantage of it is also a testament of how important we believe is to safeguard the health and security of our people in the continent. Thank you.
Honorable Deputy Minister, thank you so much. And I'd just like to remind colleagues that we are taking your questions in the Q&A function of the Zoom app, so please post your questions there. Identify yourselves and your organization. We've already had some questions come through, so let me start with that. And Dr. Hatchett and Dr. Mihigo, you can answer this. It's from Maggie Foselido from One Africa TV in Namibia. So I think these are very pertinent questions, given the fact that, I mean, we can talk about the complex issues, but the basics, just how safe is the vaccine and how will African countries benefit? What about affordability? I know, Dr. Mihigo, you touched on that, some of that about the funding and donors in the procurement for vaccine development. So perhaps if you can just give us a little bit more. And Dr. Hatchett, if you can also talk to some of that, especially the efficacy of the vaccine so far that's being tested in Africa. So I'll hand over to you, Dr. Mihigo, first, and then Dr. Hatchett, you can answer thereafter.
Yeah, thank you very much, Steve, for this question. Maybe I will start by responding to the question related to the affordability of the vaccine. And I think this is the reason why this initiative, the COVAX, has been launched, because we have learned from the past that, and I think Richard said it very well, Dr. Hatchett, that too little and too late during the H1N1 pandemic in 2009, that most of our country on the African continent was not very well prepared, and most of the time did not even have the means and opportunity to access to these vaccines. So the COVAX facility is trying to avoid this by pulling together not only the demand, but also to pull together the buying power of a member. This is a global initiative. And from the African continent in particular, as we have heard from Honorable Minister, high income and middle income countries have agreed to self-finance the vaccines. And I would like really to thank those countries for doing so. But for the rest and the majority of the country, they are going to be supported through the COVAX Advanced Market Commitment, which is an initiative that has been put together to provide the vaccine for those who cannot be able to afford. And the vast majority of the country on the African continent are going to receive the vaccine through that mechanism. There was also, I think Dr. Hatchett mentioned this, the fact that with the principle of equity, it was important that a minimum of vaccine be available to the those who are really most in need of the vaccines. And these are really the people who are on the front line to fight the COVID-19 pandemic, but also people who have the elderly who are having a difficult condition. And I think WHO is working on a framework for vaccine allocation to make sure that country are well guided once it will come to prioritize the vaccine. So in terms of equity, I think the COVAX has been, the equity has been one of the principles at the center of this initiative. And on the first question on the how safe the vaccine is, I would like to kindly ask Dr. Hatchett maybe to provide some clarification on that.
Great, thank you, Richard, and thank you, CEPI. So, on the issue of safety, it is critically important that the full vaccine testing to determine both that the vaccines are effective, but also that they are safe, be conducted, and that be conducted in well-designed clinical trials. And those clinical trials are now underway. I believe there are 9 vaccines that have now entered the last stage of clinical testing, phase 3 clinical trials. Many more vaccines, probably over 35 at this point, have entered human clinical trials, and they are being tested in a number of settings globally. And it is important to test vaccines in different populations because there can be different responses among different populations. 2 of the vaccines that CEPI has funded, the vaccine being developed by AstraZeneca and the vaccine being developed by Novavax, are now being tested in South Africa. They are the first vaccines to be tested on the African continent. We hope that there will be more. We have been working closely. Dr. John Nkingasang, the director of Africa CDC, is a CEPI board member, and we have worked closely with him as he has developed the African vaccine strategy that was presented and approved by the African Union. And we look forward to working with him and with WHO through their Solidarity 3 trial that they have proposed to potentially test additional vaccines in African settings. And we think that is very important. In terms of the data that we have seen so far, this data is somewhat limited. The scientific reports have begun to be published for the earliest phase clinical trials. These are typically very small trials that are focused on showing the safety of the vaccines and to determine the dose that will be used in later trials to see if the vaccines actually can prevent COVID-19 disease. I will say that the early data, while it is limited, is encouraging for a number of different approaches to COVID-19 vaccine development, and that is leading vaccine experts to have guarded optimism that in fact we will be able to demonstrate that the vaccines work. In the early phase trials, they have been shown to be well tolerated and no dangerous safety signals have emerged. But we need to test these vaccines in much larger settings, and the larger trials will include tens of thousands of people and will be our best indicator as to the true effectiveness of the vaccines, and they will also give us much more confidence about their safety. It is, of course, critically important that these vaccines be evaluated by strong regulatory agencies and be shown to be safe and effective before they can be released. Our current estimate, this has been our estimate since the beginning of the vaccine development efforts. Our ambitious goal was to have vaccines begin to become more broadly available within 12 to 18 months of the initiation of the programs, which means in the first half of 2021. And right now, we think we are still on target potentially to begin delivering vaccines more broadly in the first half of 2021. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Hatchett. There are some interesting questions I see in the Q&A section, and one of them I think is one that it should be interesting to get a reply to, but we'll do that later, about building laboratories on the African continent. But let's go to Naftali Wara, who writes from Zingo News Agency. And Honorable Minister Mitoho, perhaps you can answer this, because it speaks about, the kind of experience that Africa will have in the vaccine development. But more importantly, one of the questions that is being asked is, do you think that African communities, health officials, or policy makers will trust any COVID-19 vaccine that will be rolled out on the market? And if it's true that COVID-19 vaccine will be the magic bullet to finally contain the pandemic in Africa and elsewhere. So if you could please answer from your country experience and what you have done, what efforts you've undertaken for inclusivity, buy-in from community and healthcare officials and policymakers.
Yeah, thank you for the question. From the Equatorial Guinea perspective, I think the government position has consistently been that all effort to contain the pandemic in the country has to be free for all citizens. And in fact, from the get-go, we're trying to ensure that the laboratory that we set up as a reference laboratory for our testing effort would be one that should cover the entire country and will ensure a logistic system that will secure any needs in terms of sample collection or even supply delivery. We put in place significant measures in terms of making sure that we have enough material, equipment for most of our health center that we had identified as the health sentinels for a specific area. And also we set up in 2 main cities what would be our main isolation unit in terms of COVID-19. So in that respect, everything that had to do with the treatment or even the testing effort and availability or access of what has been described as the gold standard as per the international community in terms of what would be the appropriate treatment depending on the different stages of the disease, that those needs are covered for the entire population. In fact, one of the recent actions that we have just taken has to do with the acquisition with some critical drugs that like remdesivir, that we know that can be significantly expensive for some of our countries, but we did take the effort or the step, to make sure that at least in what we have developed as a list of the main drugs or treatment, that we will have that as well in country. So in some, our approach has always been that any effort taken to stop the pandemic, it should not include any effort from the citizen to cover for that cost, because that can be in detriment of actually controlling the disease, because then we might be able to have some pockets of our population that might not have the means to actually ensure the treatment. So this is in fact the position that we want to also take into the international forum and even in this type of platform, now that we kind of looking at the situation in which we believe that the pandemic in the country is quite controlled, but that we think that that is not the end game. So the end game probably will have to do with the efforts like what this platform is trying to achieve, which is to get access to vaccine. And we are trying to be as well proactive in moving toward that goal, to be active member of the platform, to secure that Equatorial Guinea and many other African countries in our condition will also have access to the vaccine, with the goal of also serving the most vulnerable groups at first, and perhaps if it's possible, and we know that we are going through very economic difficult times, but if the financial circumstances are aligned, and perhaps also ensure that the entire population will have access to the vaccine.
Thank you, Honourable Minister. If I could just appeal to the panelists to keep as short as possible your answers. There are lots of questions that are coming through. I'm going to pass the next one on to Dr. Mihigo. It's from Pamela Kumbo at SABC Channel Africa. This question is about the vaccine itself, whether it will be free of cost, and what criteria will be used for those who will get the vaccine, and also the criteria that will be used for African countries to receive funding for this vaccine development. If you can, if you could please answer that question in French, but I'd like to also ask another question from Andy Meldrum in Associated Press in Johannesburg, because he was asking earlier on if there's going to be laboratories in Africa where the vaccines will be produced. If you could answer that in English, but I will remind you. So Dr. Mihigo, you can go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Alors, pour la question de notre collègue en Afrique du Sud, est-ce que les vaccins seront gratuits? Quels sont les critères pour l'allocation de vaccins? Comme je l'ai expliqué tantôt, le processus que nous sommes en train de discuter aujourd'hui, le COVAX Facility, est une initiative globale, effectivement, qui vise à rendre le vaccin accessible à tout le monde, de manière à ce que les personnes vulnérables, mais également les pays qui ne peuvent pas payer, puissent également avoir accès à ces vaccins. Alors, il y aura deux mécanismes particuliers. Les pays à haut revenu économique, comme nous venons de le voir avec la Guinée équatoriale, pourront et se sont engagés à financer eux-mêmes à 100% l'achat de ces vaccins. Et nous avons environ 8 pays au niveau de l'Afrique qui sont dans cette situation. Mais pour le reste, les 46 autres pays au niveau de la région africaine, ils vont recevoir le vaccin de manière gratuite avec l'appui de Gavi, IMC Platform. Et la manière dont ce vaccin sera distribué, c'est que pour un premier temps, 20% de la population pourra avoir accès à ce vaccin. Et ce 20% a été déterminé de manière à ce que, premièrement, on puisse couvrir d'abord les agents de santé, ceux qui sont sur vraiment le devant de la scène pour lutter contre la pandémie. Deuxièmement, les personnes âgées, parce que comme on l'a vu, ce sont eux qui sont le plus, qui ont été disproportionnellement affectés par la maladie. Et enfin, les personnes qui présentent certaines comorbidités ou des maladies qui viennent compliquer cela. L'OMS est en train de travailler sur un protocole d'allocation des vaccins que les pays peuvent utiliser pour prendre leurs décisions eux-mêmes. Donc, voilà un peu comment ça va se passer pour la plupart des pays. Donc, de rassurer notre audience aujourd'hui que lorsque les vaccins seront disponibles, ils pourront être disponibles dans tous les pays de manière proportionnelle à la taille de leur population. Now, on the question on the laboratories, I think I would like to compliment what Minister Mitoa said. I think we've come a long way, really, since the start of this pandemic. In March or February, when the first case started in Africa, less than 5 to 10 countries were able to have the molecular capacity to diagnose COVID-19. Today, all the 54 countries have both the molecular capacity to conduct PCR tests on the continent. It has really been a huge effort to scale up the laboratory capacity in the country. And within countries, they've also not only have the capacity strengthened at national level, but also decentralize the testing capacity up to the regional level. Now, with regards to the capacity or the capability of some of the laboratories to produce the vaccine, I think that's a completely different game. And for the moment, and I would like to invite also Dr. Hatchett to comment on that. We don't have the capacity on the African continent to produce those vaccines. But there are a lot of prospects, there are a lot of discussion, particularly through the African Union, to see how member states can improve, scale up their capacity to be able to also in the future participate in this global effort and become able to produce vaccines. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mihigo. Dr. Hatchett, perhaps you would like to add your bit on that, but also please answer this question from Svet Listig. He's from Health Policy Watch Geneva Solutions. Basically, what he's asking is whether CEPI, the WHO, or Gavi promote vaccine clinical trials, and if so, is the Clinical Research Coalition being spearheaded by DNDi? And also about the lack of clinical trials in Africa, whether or not this is an issue, and if so, why? Dr. Hatchett?
Sure. Just jotting down your question so I can answer all of them. To answer the question that Richard answered, and just to say that we have monitored the efforts to develop COVID-19 vaccines globally, and these are very significant. We are aware of at least 4 efforts, and these are very early efforts, sort of at the basic research level, to develop COVID-19 vaccines in Africa. Those candidates are still in very early stages, have not reached clinical trials, but they are taking place, and I think that's a credit to Africa. There is, as Richard said, a very limited capability currently to manufacture vaccines in Africa. There's certainly a manufacturing facility in Senegal, other manufacturing facilities in South Africa. Many African nations have ambitions to develop their biotechnology sectors and to develop a local vaccine manufacturing capability. I think this, in the era after COVID, after the pandemic subsides, I think there will be heightened interest in pursuing the ability to manufacture vaccines regionally and within countries, but it is very limited right now. I believe there are some discussions ongoing. I'm not at liberty to name the companies where there may be some production of product within Africa, and that would certainly be a landmark and a great achievement. We will do what we can to facilitate that. In terms of promoting clinical trials, CEPI, through our investments in a number of vaccine candidates, are funding the performance of clinical trials, funding the production of material to be used in clinical trials. WHO, as I mentioned earlier, has been a strong advocate for a global clinical trial capability, which they have dubbed Solidarity 3. This is still in the process of being developed, but the idea is to create a global network within which multiple vaccines could be tested rapidly to allow a number of vaccine candidates to progress, and it would certainly be the intention as that capability hopefully is stood up and becomes functional for some of that testing to be performed in Africa. Africa does have a number of countries with very developed clinical trial capabilities, and that would be leveraged. There was a specific question about D&DI. D&DI may be involved with some of the testing of COVID-19 therapeutics. I don't know that for a fact. They are not currently involved directly in the planning of the vaccine clinical trials, at least not within the COVAX effort. But certainly we know the organization and have a tremendous respect for what they accomplished. The final question was about whether the lack of clinical trials in Africa was a concern. I mentioned in my earlier remarks that 2 of the vaccines that CEPI has supported are now being tested in Africa. We would like to see more vaccines be tested in Africa, and in more than just the location of South Africa. South Africa, of course, has a very developed clinical trial capability. It's an easy place to perform clinical trials on the continent, and we would like to take advantage of the developing capabilities in other parts of the continent and in other populations. Obviously, the African population is not homogeneous, and it is important to test vaccines in the populations in which they are going to be used, if at all possible.
Dr. Hatchett, thank you very much. And just also a reminder to my media colleagues as well that I know there are lots of questions. We really are endeavoring to get all of them answered. But if you could also keep your questions to a basic minimum. When you have 5 questions, we try and honor all of that, but it's not very easy. And it does take longer, therefore, for the participants to respond to your question. Irene from Spanish News Agency, Irene Escudero, is asking this question to the Honorable Vice Minister. So I think we'll just truncate it by saying, Minister, that Irene wants to know about the process of ensuring financing for the vaccine development. How is that going to be managed? And also wanting to know about the reopening of schools, that you have done that with 50% capacity. How have you done this? Have you accommodated by hiring more teachers and creating a better space as well in the schools? If you would like to answer that in Spanish, Minister, you're more than welcome to do that as well.
Muchas gracias por la pregunta. En principio, en lo que concierne a la primera pregunta, en cuanto a cómo podríamos llegar a asegurar lo que es la financiación de la vacuna, pues en principio en el Guinea Ecuatorial el gobierno esta disponibilidad la estamos manejando desde el punto de vista presupuestario. Entonces hemos hecho unos cálculos, análisis en función de la población crítica, digamos más vulnerable con la que contamos, y es la que pensamos que debería ser la prioridad primero para poder garantizar un acceso de esa vacuna a ellos. Se está hablando en principio de un 20% que tendrían acceso los países en vías de desarrollo como los nuestros, y eso es lo que hemos tratado de asegurar, pero no significa que los esfuerzos se van a limitar solo a ese grupo más vulnerable. Nuestra intención es que podamos garantizar el acceso a la gran mayor cantidad posible de nuestra población. En cuanto a la apertura de las escuelas, obviamente, como bien usted ha señalado, hemos tomado ciertas medidas, y una de esas medidas es que las aulas se tienen que tener a su 50% de su capacidad. Ha habido todo un despliegue, un dispositivo que va a tratar de hacer lo que son test aleatorios a esas escuelas para asegurar que en ningún momento podamos tener algún tipo de brote, y más allá de las medidas que se han impuesto para que tanto los directivos de esos centros, el profesorado y los alumnos puedan tratar de garantizar en la medida de lo posible el cumplimiento de estas medidas, como el llevar las mascarillas, guardar los distanciamientos social y de las manos. Entonces, las escuelas, en principio, se ha hecho un análisis. Nosotros, en base a la reducción de la capacidad de las aulas, no hemos considerado la idea que se tuviese que contratar más, sino que se tuviera diferentes turnos, o incluso algunas escuelas que solo contaba con un único turno, a lo mejor se tendría 2 o incluso 3 turnos para tratar de compensar con lo que podría ser la reducción de la capacidad de los alumnos por escuela. Ahora, para aquellos centros que necesiten algún refuerzo, pues tenemos una estrategia que donde sean públicos o privados, el Ministerio de Educación podrá ofrecer el apoyo necesario para que esos centros puedan contar con el profesorado necesario en función de que se les habría ampliado el horario educativo porque hay una menor capacidad de absorción por aula. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Honorable Vice Minister, and to the colleagues who obviously are not French, Spanish speaking, we do empathize that we don't have an interpreter at the moment, but that was also for the benefit of Spanish TV that requested that. So please indulge us on that one. So next question for you, Dr. Mihigo, is from Anna at Associated Press, Cara Anna at Associated Press. So she wants to know about the vaccine doses that can be produced in Africa and what commitments these companies like Oxford and AstraZeneca have made in transferring their technology so that they can be made locally. And also asking about if African countries must rely solely on vaccines imported from outside of the continent. If that is the case, what guarantees will there be that the vaccines will be received in a timely manner if this is the situation? Dr. Mihigo?
Thank you, Tsipo. So I think as we explained before, in terms of the vaccine dose that can be produced in Africa, I think Richard Hatchett have clearly said that, and we know the lack of current installed capability of vaccine production, at least with regard to COVID-19 in our region. But I think globally, there is a major challenge of producing enough vaccines to cover the entire population. We know very well, first of all, that we have not yet any vaccine that we can say is working. So I think it will be important, first of all, to make sure that we have a vaccine that has been licensed and then the scaling up the capacity. But our colleague at the CEPI are clearly working in the background to anticipate some of these needs on how to help the scale up of vaccine production in case we have a vaccine that is licensed and become pre-qualified. So those are the things that probably will happen in parallel to make sure that there is enough doses that could be made available to cover those who are more in need. So this will probably be a staggered approach that will take some time to make sure that there is enough capacity, there is enough vaccines that could cover those who are in need. And in parallel, as I've said before, there are a lot of now discussion initiatives on the continent to make sure that the situation we are living today, I think after COVID, things needs to change. Things needs to change to make sure that member state African countries can have the capability really to produce vaccines in case of an emergency or a pandemic like this. Beyond the current installed capacity that we have explained, like yellow fever that is produced in Senegal, or some of the vaccines that are filled in South Africa, we need absolutely to make sure that we have enough capacity. Now, is the vaccine the only solution? I think this question was also asked before, if it is a magic bullet. I think that's not true. I think we will need to continue absolutely to implement the non-pharmaceutical intervention that are been proven effective, and by the way, that have even led us to where we are today in trying to secure the population, making sure that people adhere to basic hygiene measure, making sure that we keep that distancing between people while in a crowded places. So our social life has been very much challenged by this pandemic, and the vaccine will definitely help to come to a sort of a normal situation. This is what we call the new normal. But before we get to that point, it's quite important that we continue to observe, to implement, and to make sure that population are adhering to the preventive measure that are working, by the way. Over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mihigo. Dr. Hatchett, this is from Elizabeth Marab, from a health journalist in Kenya, basically wanting to know about this perception of Africans being treated as guinea pigs in this whole vaccine candidate trials that we're seeing. This is something that's obviously been raised a number of times, and you mentioned earlier on that you have built into the system ways of ensuring that vaccine multilateralism, as you called it, is respected. So how is this going to be implemented? What are the stickler points? What is the litmus test that people are not transgressing the principles behind this thing?
Sure, no, thank you. The issue about testing of products in African populations, potentially exposing African populations to risks that other countries might not be willing to assume, but that's a very, very sensitive issue. Obviously, there is a history that has given rise to those concerns, and I think we're all mindful of never doing something that would put populations at risk in that way. These vaccines are being tested globally. They are being tested rapidly because of the urgency of the pandemic. And we are trying to move the vaccines through clinical trials as quickly as we can while accumulating the data to show that the vaccines are effective and safe. We are very concerned that vaccines not be rolled out or administered broadly to people until they are proved to be effective and safe. And certainly there are environments where there are strong political pressures that are being exerted to speed the development and delivery of vaccines. CEPI really is adamant that the data be accumulated and that the basis for delivering the vaccines be data showing that they are safe and effective rather than arbitrary timelines. In terms of how vaccines will be received in a timely manner, which I think is also important, one of the propositions behind COVAX is that unlike in 2009, where vaccine went to wealthy countries first, and only then, much later, after the pandemic had essentially come and gone, was it delivered to countries that were not as well off. The idea behind COVAX is that when vaccines are shown to be safe and effective, that they will be delivered at the same time to populations in wealthy countries, middle-income countries, and in lower-income countries. One thing we know, and I think this is really important to underscore, and it relates to the strategy behind the targeting the 20% that Richard mentioned at the beginning, is that when vaccines begin to become available, we don't know yet which vaccines will be successful. When they begin to become available, they will only initially become available in comparatively small quantities, and it is critically important that that vaccine be used in the most effective way possible. And our hypothesis is that if we use the vaccine to protect healthcare systems and to prevent needless suffering and death, we can take the sting out of the pandemic, and we can do that much more rapidly, and we don't need to vaccinate 100% of the population to do that, but we do need to do that globally. And so our goal, as I said, is to deliver the vaccines at the same time to countries at all income levels and to promote prioritization among the populations that need it most.
Thank you, Dr. Hatchett. Honorable Minister, if you would like to also weigh in on that question from your perspective, the vaccine trials that are taking place and whether or not Africa is being taken advantage of. Is it possible to make us guinea pigs? This has been a source of much controversy, as I mentioned. There's also a question here from Christine Rowe, who writes from Forbes, who wants to know about the high levels of vaccine hesitancy, in turn saying that is there a way of making cash transfers feasible, conditional on vaccination? Is that something that you have encountered?
Okay, I honestly think that those concerns are legitimate. I think our population should be able to speak about their concerns, and those concerns are taken into account. The way that we, as public servants, we believe that this should be kind of filter to us in terms of our responsibility to ensure them that we hold their interests as best, is to make sure that whatever vaccine that we get access to, that vaccine has all the security and the protocol compliance necessary to guarantee a final product that will not expose our people in any way. That's why we believe that the platform like the one that had been set up are very important, critical, because that platform allows for all the required steps that such an endeavor like a vaccine development or trial and setting should respect all the requirement that is needed for such endeavor. That's why we believe that the best way moving forward, given the urgency to get a safe vaccine, is to use the opportunity that this COVAX initiative is providing, because we are looking of a global solution that is not only targeting the population of Africa, rather than the first or any possible vaccine that might come to the market that could comply with all the requirements that are needed to be categorized as a safe vaccine, that it will have that we as African also will have access to that same type of product. I think the concerns are valid, and I think we should take that seriously, and what it in turn means for us as government official is just to make sure that those vaccines we get access to are safe for our population. And I think the platform that we're setting forth is one of the requirements, just to make sure that people have access to safe and vaccine that is at an affordable price. I think the issue about clinical trial have no ground in this context, because those clinical trial, if are done under the supervision of RIBs, of even the WHO coalition of vaccine initiative in Africa, which is AVRF, I think all those concerns should be communicated. I mean, those steps and actions should be communicated back to the people, because these are not pharmaceutical just coming to test how effective a vaccine is, but this is a global effort that is being done.
to interrupt you and just ask you to very, very briefly, please, answer Christine Rowe's question, because I think it's an important thing. It talks about vaccine hesitancy and whether or not vaccination should be made conditional to cash transfers. Is that something that you would consider as a country? Have you been confronted with this choice at any point? Has this been a reality for you?
This is a question for me, or?
Yes, I'm asking you because I just want to understand what your possible experience has been about vaccine hesitancy. Has there been any of that? I know you're part of these trials now, but in a case where there is that hesitancy, do you think cash transfers conditional to vaccination is something that ought to be considered? If I could ask you to please answer very, very briefly.
Well, and the very direct answer is that we are actually not experiencing any vaccine hesitancy in the country. We have no data that is suggesting that that is an issue that we are facing, but that can become an issue because we know right now that people are interconnected. So through social media, and this is all over the place, and this is a global trend. And ultimately, that might become an issue here as well. And I don't think the cash transfer might be the approach, depending on the circumstances. I think we, as a governmental institution and empowered to public safety, I think we just have to make sure that people understand that this is a public health concern and that the step needs to be taken to make sure that everybody is vaccinated when we have a vaccine in place. So the cash transfer, I do not believe it might be a way forward for us, particularly countries in a developing world, because we might not even have the means to roll that out properly.
Right. Thank you so much, Honorable Minister. Let's then pass the baton on to both Dr. Mihigo as well as Dr. Hatchett. It's from Tracy Muraya, and her question is about COVAX, saying that the AU advocates for COVAX for its member states. How do you relate with COVAX as an initiative? Is it an extension of or some sort of collaboration, and what impact will it have being part of this? Would it not be counterproductive to go against what is being advocated for member states? Dr. Mihigo, you can answer first, and then we can come back to you, Dr. Hatch.
Yeah, thank you. Just to say that we are working hand in hand with our colleague at the African Union Commission and the Africa CDC. Most of the initiative in responding to COVID-19 pandemic in the region are currently being done together. So there is no particular contradiction or between the initiative that we've just mentioned, COVAX, and what we have spent almost an hour explaining the COVAX facility. I think the initiative led by the African Union is also trying to see how, and I think it's a very legitimate ambition that countries in Africa are not left behind. And I think this is what WHO, in collaboration with CEPI and Gavi, I think I've embarked on this global initiative to make sure that we are not, as I said in my introductory remark, left at the queue of the game. So I think just to reassure our colleague that we are in close collaboration and we are working very well with the African Union, Africa CDC. We had regular contacts, and I think we are looking forward even to strengthen those discussions and to make sure that whenever an efficacious and safe vaccine is available, it will be available to all the people in Africa at the same time that the developed world.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mihigo. I'm sure you've noticed, colleagues, that we have extended the time somewhat so that we can get as many of your questions in there and answered. Dr. Hatchett, your point of view on this particular question, especially around the initiative and how it'll ensure that it is in tandem with what the African Union wants for its member states?
Sure. No, I just want to reiterate some of the points that Richard just made. We are very supportive of the African Union's efforts. I think they are complementary. As I mentioned earlier, Dr. Nkengasong is, on the CEPI board. I speak with him frequently, and I certainly think that the aspirations of the initiative in terms of clinical trials, in terms of African self-sufficiency, in terms of securing vaccine for Africa, I think they're highly aligned with what we have proposed. So I actually, I do think we need to make sure that the efforts are coordinated. I don't see them as being in competition.
Okay, so let's get your final comments then, and I'll come to you, Honorable Minister, to talk about what is it that you think that African countries are doing right, and just from the trials that you've been involved in, when do we think the first one will be available for Africa? Honorable Minister? Okay, so I'm not sure if the Honorable
Yes.
Minister... Okay.
Hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you, sir.
Okay. So I think is being very proactive, perhaps because of past experiences with viruses, whether it's with Ebola and so on. And I think that kind of gave us the acuteness to be able to see this as a significant threat from the beginning, even when many countries and other areas of the world was not considering at that level. In fact, most of the countries that started closing their airspaces and putting in place measurements like a lockdown were African countries. So I think the fact that we had that past experience give us some good starting point. Now we have some countries that perhaps are not performing that well, but in general, I think that the outlook is quite positive. Now, but as I said earlier, I think we shouldn't become complacent with that, because as we know, this is a pandemic. As far as a pandemic and in a very interconnecting world as we're living right now, that at any time we can have again a setback, and this is where we need to be focused our efforts. I think we as an African country are giving what is in terms of some trials from being conducted in some of our countries. I think it's ensure those trials are under the guidance of the committees, such as the one that we have under the WHO and the one that we might in the regions of the African continent, even internally for each of their countries. I think we shouldn't relax on those, because sometimes in a situation where countries feel pressures because of the pandemic or because of the urgent need to find a solution, we might be able to easily miss some of the important steps here to guarantee the safety. So I think the call, if I part, is just to make sure that we put the security of our people at first, and then that we comply with all the safety and protocol required to get the proper approval of this vaccine and have a final product that is safe for our people.
Thank you so much, Honorable Minister. I'll come to you, Dr. Hatchett, to have your final say about the CEPI efforts. If you could also speak specifically about Africa, what are the innovations that we're seeing? What are the processes that are being undertaken? And if you have any hopes of what being available, vaccine that is, within 2020.
Sure. Let me start by first thanking the Honorable Vice Minister, having Equatorial Guinea make a commitment to COVAX is hugely important, very symbolic. I really want to convey on behalf of my colleagues our thanks to you for stepping up and for announcing that commitment publicly. In terms of, I also want to speak about the strengths of the African response. There have been more than 1 million cases of COVID-19 in Africa, certainly that have been recorded, but there are many other regions of the world that are doing less well than Africa in terms of the control. You mentioned at the very beginning of the hour the eradication of polio on the continent. That is a tremendous accomplishment, a tremendous testament to the capabilities in Africa, to the commitment of communities to defeating epidemic diseases, and it provides a strong foundation for defeating and controlling this pandemic. And I think there, in terms of innovations, in terms of delivery, in terms of outreach to communities, in terms of engagement, the rest of the world has a lot to learn from Africa. And I think African leadership, as we move into bringing a vaccine to the continent and to trying to control the pandemic, will be critically important. I guess in terms, you asked about vaccine in 2020. I believe it is possible that some of the leading vaccine candidates that have initiated phase 3 studies may generate data by the end of the year that might allow for emergency use in some settings and some populations. Whether large quantities of vaccine will become available in 2020, I think that's optimistic. I mentioned earlier, that I think vaccine will begin to become available in significant quantities within the first half of 2021. We're doing everything we can to speed that availability, but we need the data, and it's critically important, as I said, that we prove that the vaccines are safe, because we must maintain public confidence. And just my last sort of closing remark, I want to just express, how exciting it is that we've had the 78 self-financing countries, including Equatorial Guinea, indicate their commitment to joining COVAX. We have the 92 countries that will be working with the AMC together. That represents over 5 billion people that will be working together to defeat the pandemic and to ensure equitable distribution of the vaccine. When we named COVAX, COVAX as a name reminds us that the enemy that we are fighting is COVID, but it also reminds us that we are fighting that enemy together. And that is the aspiration of COVAX. That is the goal. And I'm very encouraged by the response that we've had.
Thanks, Dr. Hadgett. Dr. Mahigo, just a final word from you, and perhaps if you could also give us an up-to-date number of how many African countries are actually participating in these vaccine trials as candidates, and what do you foresee as the WHO Africa for where this is all going, and whether African governments are doing the right thing, the wrong thing. And this is from Shakira Tiabas from the Cape Argus, is one of the things that she wants to know, if there's anything that she needs to point out that African countries are doing right or wrong in this process.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Tepiso, for taking us through this very interesting discussion the last 1 hour. Maybe let me first address those few questions before I say the few concluding remarks. I think where all of this is taking us, I think as I said in my introductory remarks, I think we have seen quite some progress. We have come a long way the last couple of months. More than 1 million people have recovered from the disease. But we have at least, unfortunately, lost close to 30,000 lives on the continent. But there are some hope that we are seeing countries starting to see their number stabilized. But I think, as I've said before, we are really, this is not time to relax. This is not time to become complacent. I think we need to continue to implement the measures that have taken us so far to where we are today. We are seeing a resurgence of cases in few places, and it's quite important that country really continue to implement the measure. In terms of countries that are participating in the clinical trial, I think, as we have heard from Dr. Hatchett, for the moment, we have 2 candidate vaccines that are currently already started a clinical trial in South Africa. And interests from other countries. We know that Uganda have been approached to start some clinical trial. We have seen a discussion with Kenya, but also other countries that are interested. And I think, as it was said, it's quite important that a clinical trial happen in Africa, in our local context, because that will give us enough data, will give us enough element to make sure that these vaccines are working in our local ecosystem. And I would like here really to reiterate some of the points that my colleagues raised before in terms of clinical trial. WHO is working with member states through a platform that we call AVAREF, which is the African Vaccine Regulatory Forum, to make sure that the most international standards that are currently applied for clinical trial elsewhere are also applied in Africa. So to make sure that the same standards that are applied in a high income country are the same that are currently going on in Africa. And we have quite a very positive experience in that regard. For those who knows, a vaccine that has been developed for Africa, deployed for Africa, is the meningitis A conjugate vaccine. This is a vaccine that was tested in Africa, launched since 2010 in West Africa, and have led us to literally the elimination of outbreak of meningitis type A. So we do have the infrastructure in Africa to conduct a clinical trial. We do have the expertise with local scientists. WHO is supporting member states to make sure that the same standards, international standards, are applied everywhere. And let me maybe conclude by really thanking our 2 other panelists today. Honorable Mitoa, really thank you very much for your great comments, and Dr. Hatchett with CEPI. And I would like really to reassure member states here that WHO, we are currently working to support country to make sure that they are well prepared once the vaccine become available. We have set up a task force, a regional task force for COVID-19 vaccine readiness and delivery that is going to support all the countries to develop their own plans for the deployment of the vaccine. We are going to work with the local community, NGO, civil society, to make sure that the vaccines is deployed in a very safe manner in all the environment. And then finally, really to thank our auditors today, but also the journalists for the very good question that were raised. That also is an expression on how the public is perceiving this. And WHO will always be there to make sure that we can provide not only the right platform for such discussion, but also to provide the right answer to our community here in this region. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mihigo. And once again, to my media colleagues, I hope that we didn't take up too much of your time. I know that you have diaries that you work on, but we did extend this for your benefit because there were so many questions. And as Dr. Mihigo has already said, that there were so many interesting questions and conversations coming out of that. So thank you very much once again to the panelist. Dr. Richard Mihigo is the WHO Program Area Manager for Immunization and Vaccine Development. Dr. Richard Hatchett, thank you very much, Chief Executive Officer of CEPI, Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. And thank you once again, Honorable Mitoha Ondoho Ayekeba, who is the Vice Minister of Health and Social Welfare, the Government of the Republic of Equatorial Guinea. Thanks to all of you, our colleagues, for joining in and having a discussion. And just as an aside, Dr. Mihigo, as you were sometimes struggling to say my name, but every time you said CEPI, it almost sounded like how my name is truncated, which is CEPI. So anytime you ever wonder how to remember saying it, just remember, think of CEPI. And I was tempted, I must say, to mute myself every time you said CEPI. On that light note, that's how we end the press conference.